Welcome back to an introduction to writing philosophy. This lecture will focus on writing an introduction, meaning writing the introductory paragraph of your philosophy paper. By the end of this lecture, you should know what an introduction needs to include, understand the purpose of an introduction, and be able to create a mini outline of your introduction paragraph. So your introduction has a particular job to do. Basically, that job is to prepare your audience to read your paper. Your introduction is supposed to inform your reader what your paper is about, the position that you're arguing for, and how you plan to go about doing that. You want it to be clear to your reader what your paper is about so that they can decide whether or not it's relevant to what they're interested in. You want it to be clear to your reader what position you take and the argument you intend to raise so that your reader can evaluate whether you've done that successfully or not by the end of your paper. And finally, you want your reader to have some idea of how your paper will be structured. That way they can easily follow it as they read. To do its job well, your introduction needs to have a few important components. First, there is a hook. This is something to grab your reader's attention, specifically to call attention to the problem or question that you are addressing in your paper. Next, your introduction needs to set the stage. This is where you briefly explain the context and/or significance of the problem or question that you're focusing on. There's your thesis statement, which, as we've discussed previously, is a short declaration of the goal you intend to achieve with your paper, the argument that you plan to raise. And finally, there is a roadmap, which usually appears right at the end of your introduction paragraph. This is where you briefly explain the steps that you'll take in your paper to accomplish your goal, which in the case of philosophy is defending the position that you've outlined. So let's take a look at each of these components one at a time, starting with the hook. What makes for an effective hook? Where does it go? Well, your hook is the first sentence of your introduction. In fact, it's the first sentence of your whole paper. And besides your title, it's what draws the reader in and sets the tone for the rest of your piece. An effective hook will do one or possibly all of the following things. It will call attention to a problem, invite the reader to ask a question, and in some cases, your hook may even hint at the solution that you intend to provide or the answer that you plan to offer. Let's look at a couple examples of effective hooks from other philosophy papers. We'll start with Thomas Nagel's What's It Like to Be a Bat? This was a major essay in the philosophy of mind. And here's the first sentence of Nagel's paper. Consciousness is what makes the mind-body problem really intractable. Intractable means difficult to solve, but more importantly, it also means difficult to know even where to begin if you want to try and solve something. So this sentence is short, sweet, and to the point. But what else makes it an effective hook? What else makes it effective at drawing the reader in? Besides, of course, Nagel in this case has a very interesting title, What's It Like to Be a Bat? But the first sentence of his paper does a few important things. It introduces a problem. In this case, he's saying that consciousness makes resolving the mind-body problem really difficult. It invites the reader to ask a further question. Questions like, is that true? If it is true, then what exactly is it about consciousness that makes the mind-body problem so difficult to solve? And it hints that if we want to solve the mind-body problem, we have to change the way we think about consciousness. So the implication is that that's part of what Nagel intends to do with his paper. Let's look at another example. This is from Don Marquis' 1985 essay, Why Abortion is Immoral. Here's the first sentence of Marquis' paper. The view that abortion is, with rare exceptions, seriously immoral has received little support in the recent philosophical literature. What makes this an effective hook? First of all, it calls attention to something. It calls attention to the fact that there are very few philosophers who make the arguments that abortion is immoral. And as Don Marquis goes on to explain in more detail in the rest of his introduction, he points out that there are few philosophers who take a secular approach to defending the view that abortion is immoral. In other words, most people, Don Marquis seems to be implying, believe that the only way you could possibly argue for abortion being immoral is if you apply some sort of fallacious reasoning to your argument, or you rest your argument on some kind of religious assumptions or religious dogma. That's what Don Marquis is trying to challenge with this paper, which is one of the reasons that many ethics classes continue to read it today. Second thing it does is it invites the reader to ask questions. Questions like, is that true? Is it true that there are very few philosophers who view abortion in this way? Can a philosopher make such an argument while remaining logical and without appealing to religious doctrine? And it hints that there is an approach to defending this view from a purely philosophical perspective, but we just haven't heard it yet. And again, the implication is that that's what Marquis intends to do in his paper. Next thing your introduction needs to do is set the stage. Setting the stage refers to giving context to the problem or question that you're addressing in your paper. And this can be accomplished in a couple of ways. You can set the stage by stating the opposition, which is to say, reference a popular opposing view and briefly explain why it is flawed. For example, you could say something like, many have argued that, however, this is problematic because. Or alternatively, you could say something like, some hold that blank, however, this neglects some aspect or another that you think is important. Another way you can set the stage is by explaining the stakes, explaining why solving this problem or answering this question actually matters. You could say something like, how we address this problem has ramifications for some other issue, which we saw in Thomas Nagel's paper, that addressing the problem of consciousness will allow us to address the mind-body problem. Don Marquis' paper is also a good example of setting the stage. Beyond the first sentence that he writes, in the rest of his introduction, he talks about kind of how the landscape of the abortion debate has sort of played out up to the point that he's writing. And he does a pretty good job of summarizing that debate. And then what he does is basically say, and here's what I'm going to do differently. That's really important to do early on in your paper. You'll hint at that in your introduction, but you'll go into a little bit more detail in your next section, which is your context and background. But for the purposes of an introduction, you need to just give a little bit of information about the background and the significance of the debate that you are participating in. Next, of course, there is your thesis statement, probably one of the most important components of an introduction and, by extension, the rest of your paper as well. And remember that your thesis is the position that you take on an issue, whereas the thesis statement is a clear and succinct explanation of that position, along with a reason why you hold it. In other words, your thesis statement here is basically a brief expression of the goal that you intend to accomplish by the end of your paper. Here are a couple of templates that you can follow to structure your thesis statement. One common template is to say, in this paper, I intend to argue that, and that's where you would put your thesis, because, and that's where you would put at least one major reason why you hold this view. There's another thesis statement template that you can follow, and in fact, I think if you follow this template, it seems like you're doing a little bit more work, but it actually also means that you need to do maybe less work in terms of setting the stage, because you end up accomplishing a lot of that with this template. And as I indicate in the slide that you can see, this template is not my own invention. This comes from one of my philosophy professors, Jeffrey Watson. So credit to him for this template. And I've used this many times in my own work. I think it's a very versatile tool to use. So basically what you're doing here is you're stating the opposition and explaining why you're doing something different. So you say, although it is tempting to believe that, that's where you would state the opposing view, because, and then at least one reason why people hold this opposing view, I intend to argue that, there's where your thesis would go, because there's where a main reason why you hold this view would go. Again, what you're doing here is something really cool. You're stating the opposition, and you're also showing the reader that you understand why the opposing view is held by at least some people. And you're doing a lot of stuff in just a few words. So finally, there is your roadmap. A roadmap is basically a short summary of the steps you intend to take to accomplish your goal with your paper, defending your thesis. The best way to think about a roadmap is to make sure that each sentence references a major section of your paper. So your background and context, your argument and exposition, and finally your objections and responses. Including a roadmap at the end of your introduction ensures that your reader will understand the purpose of each section of your paper as they're working their way through. Now, if you make it clear to your reader what exactly they should expect and they're interested in your topic, they will put in the work to read it. They'll understand that they may have questions in the beginning, but that those will likely be answered in the rest of your paper. So you don't need to make your reader swallow the ocean, as it were, in the very first few sentences of your paper. They'll understand that this is just the introduction. So that's something to keep in mind. Your introduction does not need to be long. In fact, a good rule of thumb is that your introduction should really only take up about 10% of your whole paper. Look for examples of how other philosophers have written introductions. You can see the syllabus for additional sample templates and specific examples. You can ask me for help if you need, of course. But you also have been doing research up to this point, so by now you probably do have a few examples at your disposal already. Take a look at what the philosophers you plan to cite in your paper do when it comes to writing introductions. Finally, last piece of advice I would say is that you may want to save writing your introduction and conclusion till the very end of your paper. That's because it can be a little bit difficult to know what you're introducing or concluding until you've actually written the body of the paper.